It really is my pleasure to introduce Bob Lackey, the co-leader of the Salmon 2100 project. Bob is a senior fisheries biologist for the Environmental Protection Agency in Corvallis, Oregon. He is a professor at Oregon State University in both fisheries and an adjunct professor in political science. And Bob is going to be introducing the project. So with that, Bob Lackey.
Thank you very much, Gail, and I want to make one thing perfectly clear here. I actually have 45 minutes, so whoever's keeping time out there, don't get confused. Okay, I want to acknowledge my co-project leaders, Denise Locke, who you'll hear about later today, talking about what some of the participants didn't talk about, and that'll come towards the end of the morning, and Sally Duncan, who's also had a significant role in the project, and she's the main person producing the book that'll come out of this project sometime early this summer. Okay. I was asked by the program committee to cover three things. The first is to provide a brief historical context. Now, for many of us, and many of you in the audience I've known for many years, this is old news, but it's important sometimes to refresh on some of these historical things and provide some context and perspective. I'm going to spend the bulk of my time with the middle part, and that is the most likely future. A most likely future is not necessarily a good future, it's not necessarily a bad future, it's just the one, if you look at the trends, what's most likely to happen, non-judgmentally. And then finally, I'm going to talk about how we developed alternative futures. If you didn't like that future, here's some other choices that you may want to consider. Now, 3 points of reference, and these are important. First point, no policy advocacy. This project is not predicated on an idea that we are pushing any particular policy choice. We will take it as a given that society has said we would like wild salmon in significant numbers. Now, you can argue whether society has really said that, but we'll take that as an assumption. Given that, we'll move forward. But the project itself has no policy advocacy. Second point is, I'm going to speak bluntly and candidly. This is not a political speech. It's not one to paint the information one way or the other. But so there'll be no delusional reality. This is the way it is, at least as I see it. And if you want to hear more of a feel-good talk, you can go elsewhere and listen to one of those. Mine's not necessarily going to be a feel-good talk. And I'm also going to give you the revealed truth. But it does not necessarily reflect any organization. When you work for a variety of organizations and have worked, as I have, for many, as well as our participants, none of the positions that you'll hear this morning, at least the ones from the project, are necessarily reflecting those organizational employee or their positions. Okay, historical context. You can learn a lot. In fact, I would argue that you could probably learn all the biology you really need to know by looking at the historical record so far as a policy choice perspective is concerned. And let me review some of the key points. Let's say in 1848, for whatever reason, you decided that getting gold in California really wasn't my charge in life. I'd rather be a miserly, penny-pitching fisheries biologist, and I would survey the abundance of wild salmon in this region. Of course, they were all wild. There were no hatcheries. So while everybody else is out there getting rich in California in the gold rush, you're surveying salmon abundance. You would have found salmon in abundant numbers as far south as Southern California, San Diego, maybe even a bit in Baja California, small numbers. You would have found them in abundance through California, Oregon, Idaho, a little bit into Nevada, British Columbia, Yukon, and Alaska. And if you were really industrious and continued down the Asian side, you would have found them in great numbers in the Russian Far East, some still in Japan, China, Korea, and as far south as Taiwan. Large numbers. In 2006, you never learned your lesson. You still wanted to survey the abundance of wild salmon. What would you find? You'd still find them in great abundance in Alaska, and we can argue about the details here, but fundamentally they're roughly the size of what they were in the mid-1800s. Now, there's no doubt that there are issues and concerns and problems there, but fundamentally the runs are very large. But if you'd survey them our part of the world, which includes southern British Columbia, you'd find the runs, naturally, as we all know, much reduced. How much reduced? How extensive is the reduction? Before I answer that question, it's important to keep in mind, as most of us know, there are three types of salmon. This is an obvious point for those of us who work on this all the time, but it astounds me when I talk to my barber, who's an avid fisherman. They never seem to understand the difference. Three types we're going to talk about today, and we're going to focus on wild salmon, hatchery salmon. Now, the hatchery's been around for well over 100 years, as far as in California, up starting in 1870, and those fish have been produced and planted everywhere across the Northwest. They're everywhere, and they've had a big effect in the long run on the wild runs. Second type are farm salmon. Typically, any fish you buy in Costco, Safeway, or whatever is going to be a farm salmon, especially anytime other than the summer. Most likely, those farm salmon are going to come from Chile, Scotland, Norway, some from British Columbia, and a small number from Washington State. We're not talking here about farm salmon. We are talking about wild salmon. But what exactly is a wild salmon? Obviously, hatchery fish at one time were wild. They still may be wild because they may spawn wild fish as adults. Farm salmon were always wild originally, but oftentimes they escape and they become wild. The definition I'm going to use for wild salmon is those produced from wild parents spawn naturally in wild habitat. This is not a scientific definition. It is a policy choice. It is not inherently right or wrong. It's a policy choice. Maybe a legal choice, too. But fundamentally, science can inform here, but it will not answer the question. What does this mean? It means that a second-generation hatchery fish that spawns in the wild, its offspring are wild. Again, it's a definition we're going to use for working purposes, but fundamentally it's a policy choice. Well, let's go back to that decline. If you reconstruct the run size across this region, and for this exercise it's not going to include British Columbia, if you reconstruct the runs from California northward to Washington, the runs were probably in the range of 40 to 50 million fish, all runs, Columbia, Sacramento, San Joaquin, the coastal watersheds, Puget Sound. That's a lot of fish. And we know it varies a lot year to year. It varies cyclically with ocean conditions, but we're talking roughly 40 to 50. You can probably barely see that little brown bar there. That's the current run of wild fish, roughly 5% of historical number. And this is a 30-year average, so we've dampened out some of the year-to-year variation. Well, you might say, well, look, the Sacramento San Joaquin looks about as natural as Disneyland, and therefore the big reductions probably occurred in the Sacramento, maybe the Puget Sound area, maybe the Columbia, but the other areas are probably in pretty good shape. Let's partition the decline. There's the Columbia. Historical runs, we always argue about this as scientists, but roughly 10 to 15 million fish. Long-term average, 30-year average, a few 100,000 wild fish. Move down to California, across the way there, including the Sacramento and the coastal rivers. Historical run size, maybe 5 to 8 million fish on the average. Run size of wild fish now, a few 100,000. But the interesting thing is the same pattern occurs on the coastal waters of Oregon, California, some of those areas. So the decline is not uniform, but the pattern is similar across the range. What about the causes? If you bring together people like me and many of you, we will talk about these causes all the time. These are the things that cause the decline of salmon. Mining activities in California and Central Valley in the 1850s. By the early 1850s, the newspapers at the time were saying the runs are being decimated in the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers, and it's due to intensive subsistence fishing and mining activities. Those runs have never recovered from those activities. So the runs started declining in the early 1850s. Intense industrial fishing in the late 1800s, early 1900s especially, decimated runs, changed the size composition, decimated some of the more vulnerable ones. Sluicing logs through rivers had great effects on the coastal watersheds. We go over the coast of Oregon, Washington now, especially Oregon, and say, looks pretty pristine, doesn't it? Many of those streams are down to bedrock due to sluicing activities, and it'll take hundreds of years to come back to what they were historically. Dams, no matter how you slice it, dams are not a salmon's best friends. There are thousands of dams, not just the big main stem dams, but all these little dams around the Northwest and California. Irrigation project, which oftentimes go hand in hand with dams, to continue to do a great number on salmon runs. Human activities, road construction, everything, we all know does a great number. Urbanization in general, pollution problems, And of course, hatcheries. Hatcheries are not inherently a good or bad management tool. It depends what your policy objective is. If your policy objective is to maintain large runs, fishable runs, hatchery is one tool. If your policy objective is to maintain as high as possible wild runs, it may not be the best tool. There may be other choices out there. The point of it is that we all know the causes of these declines. This is probably and arguably the best studied group of fish in the world. We know more about salmon than any other group of fish in the world. So I would argue that policy is not largely a salmon-limited issue. Okay, that was the last 158 years. It took 5 minutes to discuss and distill the key points that we need to move on to. What about the future? And that's what the project is about. Well, let's move to the second part of my talk, a long-term future. Are these kind of forecasts useful? Do they pass the laugh test? I mean, is this guy a typical university person lost in space? I mean, why are we doing this kind of thing? I would argue that in some respects it's easier to forecast 2100 than it is to forecast 2010. Because we know those runs vary a lot due to ocean conditions, climatic changes, and who knows what. But long term, we dampen out those oscillations. And so the patterns are more easy to predict. We also know that regardless of whether you formally forecast the future, anytime you analyze a policy, much less implement a policy, you are making a de facto forecast of the future. If I do this, this is how the runs are going to respond. And regardless of this, whether it's a good idea or a bad idea, we did it. Okay, what are the factors that will determine the long-term future about wild salmon? Let's get into these drivers, if you will, these things that really are important, the things that have to be changed if the forecast is to be altered. Well, some of the factors out there are either we don't know them or they're beyond control. Let me just identify a few, show you what I mean here. Ocean conditions. There is no argument that ocean conditions are important. If you go back and reconstruct runs, and in certain situations people can do this for 2,000 years, you'll find that the runs, at least some of the runs in Alaska, were the worst on record in biblical times. Now, I would hypothesize it had nothing to do with other activities in biblical times. It probably had something to do with climatic conditions or who knows what. And if you plot those runs last few hundred years, which you can do on a lot of different runs, they vary a lot with no human activities. We know that. But the reality of life is ocean conditions you can't do a lot about. So while it's important, needs to be studied, needs to be factored in, you really can't control it. Second one is climate change. Oh yeah, we could implement Kyoto. Kyoto slows the growth rate. So de facto, whether you believe climate models or not, the climate that's forecast for this region, or whatever's going to happen essentially as is, because the Kyoto protocols really aren't going to have a big effect, if any, until 2050. And there are other factors. If you think this is one that you can control, it's the brick factor. The brick factor. The G6 right now are dominated by what is often termed as old Europe, US, and Japan. By 2040, the countries of the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, will be the four largest of the G6. Only one larger will be the United States. Now, you tell me, and I'm not arguing one way or the other, how likely is it China, India, Russia, and Brazil are going to cut back their growth rates appreciably through this century? You can plug in your own policy assessment. My guess is whatever climate's going to play out from a salmon perspective, we have. Some are going to be beyond anticipation. Here's a poster of a fly fisherman killing fish. Your daddy kills animals. There are these kinds of sea changes in people's values, and if this type of philosophy, kind of a people for the ethical treatment of animals philosophy, became dominant, it might change the complexion substantially. But we can't, this is an example of one that is likely to happen, not likely to happen, possibly would happen, but we can't anticipate it. It might be important, we ought to consider it, but it's not one we can really deal with. But what about those that we can recognize and we could plausibly do something about? That's what we want to focus on. And I would argue they all deal not with biology, they all deal with human actions. And if you're going to change a direction, the future for wild salmon, if society wants to do that, you're going to have to deal with human actions, human choices, human behaviors. And we partition these into 4. If you're a lumper, you can get them down maybe to 1. If you're a splitter, you might get a dozen or some larger number. And they all deal with choices. Now, I want to give you, this is kind of like motion pictures. You know, this is going to be an R-rated movie. Okay, this one's going to be for mature audiences only. I'm going to lay this out as realistically as I can, as blunt as I can, try to be as candid. I'm going to try to be unbiased. I have no policy preference here, just to do a straight analysis. Those of you who tend to be doom and gloomers, some parts of the political spectrum, no pessimism here, no optimism. Those people who like to spin things in a very positive way, you know, good thinking will make everything happen. Okay, forget it. It's not going to happen. This is the way it is. So you've had your warning, and if you feel you're not old enough for it, you can leave now. Okay, the first core policy driver deals with how business is done, how we do commerce, how we do international trade, and so forth. And this is a very simple one. It's not right or wrong. Right or wrong is just simply a fact in my view. The current rules of commerce, how we trade, work against increasing the abundance of wild salmon. And especially problematic are trends towards international commerce and market globalization. Now, I'm not saying that the current rules are inherently bad or good. They do lots of good things. A fact of life is that the externalities like wild salmon tend to get short shrift. What do I mean? Let's look at the general characteristics, and most of us buy into this without even thinking about it. Individual choice, each of our choices economically, going to Walmart or Costco or wherever you go, these choices determine our collective priorities. Personal freedom tends to trump collective good. We have a very decentralized view. We vote, which is, you know, most people think is a good thing. That tends to create collective good. Externalities, like wild salmon, get handled outside the marketplace. And usually, and I'll give an example, they get short shrift. And the consumer is king. You make your choices by buying things, doing certain things, paying certain. You go to ski in the mountains, that's a choice. Now, there's no doubt, in my view at least, that these market-driven economies have created great wealth. There is no doubt. They work very effectively in creating great wealth, and you can argue that point, but to me the data are fairly conclusive. The centrally planned economies have more or less all collapsed, and plus they did worse for salmon, but it's really these free market economies that have boomed. Here is a median American household. Somebody figured out the average number of kids people have. In this particular one, there's 2 kids, there's a dog, probably hidden someplace back here, there's 1.1 cats. There's 2 vehicles, there's a 2-car garage, looks like there's a bunch of bikes, there's a fridge, everything. Lots of wealth, mass wealth. Great. The market-driven economies have worked. What are the costs? Well, let's look at this family. Somebody's convinced them to put all their stuff on the street to take this photograph. When they leave this, they say, okay, we got to go down to McDonald's or Burger King or wherever. When they go to McDonald's or Burger King, they'll make choices. One of the choices they'll undoubtedly buy is to buy some French fries. Let's just use a very corny example of what I mean by an externality. McDonald's buys those French fries or buys those potatoes from suppliers. In our part of the world, you get them from, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, maybe BC. Every farmer out there is competing to produce a high-quality product as cheaply as possible. If we assume that the product quality, delivering the product to the McDonald's is the same, then the only thing they're going to debate on is how to keep their costs down. And everything they do to protect salmon or anything else outside the marketplace will tend to get short shrift. Now, every potato farmer I know is not against salmon. Actually, I don't really know any potato farmers, but every farmer I know, and I'm very sure that they don't actually feel this way, none of them is against salmon. In fact, there's no one out there on the planet that's against salmon. They're just more in favor of something else. So it's not that they're inherently bad people, but that tomato that you buy in winter kills salmon. Now, I'm not saying that you should not buy a tomato in winter, but every time you go down to the market in January and buy that tomato, you have made a choice, and that choice is to cause problems for salmon. Are there better alternatives? You know, maybe these free market economies are not the best choice. You know, it's not immediately obvious to me what they are. You may have your own opinions. I definitely think it's not centrally planned, because the centrally planned economies, as I mentioned, actually did much worse for salmon. Okay, second core policy driver, scarce natural resources, and in particular, water. Great shock. Water is a very limited commodity in this region. A lot of water wars. We all are familiar with Klamath and so forth. This core policy driver that must be changed if the long-term downward trajectory for salmon is to be reversed says that this demand for critical natural resources, and especially for high-quality water, will increase through this century. Pretty obvious, unless you know a supply of water that I'm unaware of. And a lot of people say, well, you know, gee, my friends in the Corps and the Bureau of Reclamation say there's lots of things you do about water. You could, you know, pound more water. You know, dams are shown not to do great things for salmon. So some of the things that are proposed as alternatives aren't all that great for salmon either. It needs to be changed if the long-term downward trajectory is to be reversed. This competition for scarce water, increasing demand, means that the proponents of salmon are going to be in competition with cities, agriculture, industry, ski resorts, golf courses, sewer treatment plants for that same water. Now, I'm not saying there's any inherently right choice here, but the competition is going to be severe. And just to show you that we're truly nonpartisan here, this is the Klamath Water Wars, and there's 2 policy prescriptions been offered there. And on the left, your left, there's people complaining against the Clinton proposal. On the right, they're complaining against the Bush proposal. So no matter what you do policy-wise, there's a certain fraction of the population that's going to be singularly unhappy with it. And let me give you a biological lesson. This is the kind of biology you need to know. Salmon need water to survive. There is no substitution option. If you run out of wood, you can go to steel or plastic. Salmon can't say, gee, I'm short on water, I'm going to go to liquid ammonia. It's not going to work. Every compromise in a political process relative to water tends to worsen things for salmon. Now, that may not be a bad choice, but the fact of life is, as you compete for water, any compromise results in worse things for salmon. Now, a lot of people say, well, what about climate change? Now, who knows that these things are true? Climate varies a lot naturally, and that's probably the more dominant factor relative to salmon than long-term human-caused climate change. But regardless, as I mentioned earlier, there's really not a lot you can do about it through at least 2050, if not longer. And even then, you're going to make very small incremental changes, if any. So the reality of life is that everything I've read about climate change in this region, at least, will probably be worse, neutral or worse for salmon. Not to say it's unimportant, but it's probably not going to be a major positive effect. Third core policy driver, simply the numbers of humans in the region. This core policy driver says that the sheer number of people in this region will increase. No shock. If you drove here or flew here this morning, you'll see that. Will increase, and their aggregate demand to support chosen lifestyle will constrain the abundance of wild salmon. Now, every time I leave where I work and say I'm going to talk about this core policy driver, people say, you know, you got a death wish. You're going to be attacked as being a xenophobe, a racist, if not a cultural dinosaur, you know, maybe something really right out of the space age. Don't do it. But I don't think you can talk about policy without addressing the likely forecast for humans in this region. It constrains so much of what many people propose to do. Well, what is the relationship? You know, maybe there isn't any great relationship. Well, let's look around the planet. This is the number of people. The darker the brown or red or whatever it is, the more people. Originally, salmon occurred in 4 places on the planet. Let's look at the Asian Far East. The wild salmon are largely gone in the southern half of that distribution out there in Russian Far East, Japan, Korea, and so forth. As the number of people went up, the number of wild salmon went down. Now, some of you are astute, and you'll know that salmon runs in Japan are pretty large, but they're all hatchery runs. If you move over to Europe, continental Europe, as the population grew, salmon declined. They're essentially, for practical purposes, gone on continental Europe. You still have runs in Norway and some in northern Scotland, a few other places like that, but basically where you have people there, you don't have salmon, wild salmon. If you go to eastern North America, the U.S., Northeast, is essentially Those of you who are from the Northeast, I would argue maybe there's, what, 23 wild salmon there or something like this. We debate whether they're really wild, but they're essentially gone from a practical standpoint. In the Maritimes, you still have salmon, but they're much reduced. The same pattern. Lots of people. As the people went up, the number of salmon went down. Let's look at our part of the world. We are what demographers call fill-in country. You cannot apply the UN growth projections, which say, and who knows if these are right, that the worldwide population is likely to flatten out in 2080. That's overall. We are an area that was essentially uninhabited, and now it's filling in. Let's look at the future. In our region, if we look down the road and go back to 1850, the area, for this exercise, I've not covered California. Now, those of you out there from California, California is near and dear to my heart, but there are already 40 million people there. This show is already played out. So let's look at Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and British Columbia. 1850, essentially uninhabited. Most of the endemic population had died off due to diseases. Not much immigration from the east, perhaps 100,000 people. Growth rates, human growth rates, population growth rates, pretty fast. 1900, up to 1 million. 1950, up to 4 million. Now, up to 15 million. That's Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and British Columbia. What's going to happen in the future? A few factors here. If you project out the growth rates from World War II, that occurred from World War II to now, which is, what, 60 years, the population in the region will not be 15 million people, it'll be 110 million people. Now, you can argue that, gee, those growth rates must slow down. I mean, how can they continue? They haven't really changed much in California, which has gone through this scenario. So they could arguably increase. Perhaps there's going to be social problems in California and elsewhere, and the growth rates here will increase. Or you could say, well, maybe people will have less kids. Well, the fact is that the birth rates in this region are already pretty low, barely replacement, but it's a very young population because most of us came from someplace else. So the people are already here to have a big internal generation population. And nearly 3/4 of the growth is from people coming from elsewhere. So unless you're going to change those things, particularly people coming from elsewhere, this scenario is going to play out approximately like we're talking about it. But I may be in a slight degeneration in optimism here. I assume that the growth rates will actually decline and we'll only have 65 million people. So given that these growth rates drop a lot, I think any policy prescription in this region to recover wild salmon ought to assume that the population in this area by the end of this century will be 65 million people. You can make a strong argument that it'll be greater, and you might make an argument that it'll be less. But I think for practical middle-of-the-road analyses, a quadrupling of the population by the end of this century is reasonable. Well, those are just numbers. What do they mean? I mean, how can we relate to this? Let's look at this from a salmon recovery, from a salmon-centric perspective. Go back to 1850. Now, there's no question that the population, both the native population as well as the newer people, burned, and they altered landscapes. But actually, the footprint was relatively small. If you jump up to 1900 with 1 million people, clearly there's more effects, more farming activities, more urbanization, and so forth. But again, most of the waters were relatively as they were. 1950, lots more dams, lots more agriculture, lots more everything, and you can see the footprint from a salmon standpoint is much, much greater. Jump up to right now, and you see the footprint a lot, especially in places like California, Portland area, Seattle area, Vancouver, BC area. There's a lot of activity, a lot of footprint. Well, let's look ahead. Let's look out to 2100 and look at the landscape that any policy prescription, I think, ought to assume. And in 2100, we'll have 2 metropolises in the Pacific Northwest. One, Port Jean, will be a city that was formed during this century from the growing together of Eugene, Corvallis, Albany, Salem, Woodburn, Portland, Vancouver, Washington, and the suburbs. And Port Jean will be a city of 6 million people. Probably by then we'll have a professional sports team. But if we look up the road, you'll see Sevan. Sevan will be the city formed by the growing together of Olympia, Tacoma, Seattle, Bellingham, Vancouver, BC, reaching across and out to Hope in the valley for those people who are from that region, filling in the valley, going across the southern Vancouver Island, subsuming Victoria and the southern third of the island, and it'll be a city of 30 million people. A city that reaches the current size of Tokyo or Mexico City. Now, what's that mean from a salmon perspective? This is the landscape that you're going to be dealing with. Now, I'm not saying that this is inherently good or bad. I'm just saying that is the assumption that you need to work with in any type of a policy prescription for wild salmon. Let's talk about the fourth and final core policy driver. Us personally, public choices, individual priorities. And here's the core policy driver that must be changed. Our individual and collective preferences directly determine the future of wild salmon. And here's the crunch. Substantial and pervasive changes must take place in those preferences. We're not talking here about tweaks. We're talking here about major changes if society really wants to do this. What do I mean? You're immediately going to quote polling data that shows that 85% of the people are in favor of restoring wild salmon, maybe 90%. But I say look at people's behavior, their choices, when they're given choices and they know kind of all the facts. Let's go back to a painful exercise for many of you in this room, okay? We've got brownouts and blackouts in California, and some people argue that was their own problem, they should live with it, but they had them, nonetheless they had them. And the only place you could really get the power, peaking power, was to run the hydro system into Columbia to provide that power. And this is a great political science choice because largely the scientists, the science always pretty much agreed, hey, you run these things, the water's reserved for salmon, it's not going to do good things for salmon. One of the few times that the science was pretty much stipulated. We all agreed with it. Run the hydro system, you're going to do bad things for salmon. But you got a problem in California, so what's the choice? Well, the choice was made to run the dams, the hydro system, 24/7 for 3 weeks. Now, I'm not saying that's a good or bad choice. It might even been a choice I'd make personally. But the fact it was made. Here's the lesson learned. There was no public opposition in significant amounts. Now, the various advocacy groups complained. People rang their hands, oh, bad choice, wish we didn't have to do it and all the rest of it. But the fact of life is there were no protests. I don't remember a single letter to the editor. I don't remember anybody falling on his sword over this. The national advocacy groups that you would normally think would take up this cause were silent on it. Fundamentally, people really said, gee, it was a tough choice, but hey, if it comes to air conditioners in Pasadena or salmon, this is where our priority has to be. Now, I want to make this point clear. And I'm a dog person. And this air-conditioned doghouse in Pasadena is an important thing to me, okay? Now, when the choice comes down to chewing up salmon to keep your doghouse air-conditioned or to save the water to let salmon migrate is a policy choice. It's not inherently good or bad. It's a policy choice. But to me, the lesson learned here is when push comes to shove, this gives you some sense of where the public is. Okay, let's get to the future. Given all this, what's the most likely future for wild salmon? And let's give that 4 things are going to be, back up a little bit here. 4 things are going to not change dramatically. Rules of commerce, scarce natural resources, human population growth, and our individual and collective priorities. And it's not to say they won't change. We cannot predict how these things are going to play out. If you go back to 1900, it'd be impossible to predict the 21st century. But they're not likely to change in ways that are necessarily favorable to salmon. So it's not like they're static, but there's no groundswell of change driven by concerns about salmon recovery. Given that they don't change relative to salmon, then the only conclusion I can see out there is that wild salmon, by the end of this century, will reduce to remnant runs in the lower 48 states and southern BC. Now, I want to be clear about this and not be misquoted. I do not say they will go extinct in this region. Now, you may argue that remnant runs at 2% of historical numbers are effectively extinct. That's fine, but there are still runs. There'll be runs along the coast, in my view, barring some major change, which I can't forecast. But practically speaking, in most places, they'll be functionally gone, not fishable runs. Okay, that, in my view, was the most likely future through 2100. Not inherently a good future or a bad future, but I would argue just kind of the facts of the case. Now, here's the question, part 3. What would society have to do to reverse this trend if society really wants to do it? We're not saying society ought to do it, but say if you want to reverse it, what are your choices? And that leads to the project. What we developed 24, or at least the project participants developed 24 alternative policy prescriptions that would change this. Our approach. We selected a cross-section of scientists, analysts, policy advocates across the spectrum. These people do not agree. In fact, bureaucratically and legally and every other way, they didn't want to be in the same room. In fact, we didn't put them in the same room. We kept them apart. We tried to keep the sniping and the grenade throwing to a minimum and asked them that simple question that Gail summarized. What would it take to sustain significant, sustainable runs through this century in this region? Secondly, we asked each of them to develop an independent policy prescription. No collaboration, no consensus, no policy prescriptions that turn to vanilla because you've got to satisfy every interest group. What would work? And all these will be published in the book coming out by the American Fisheries Society probably late spring or early summer. Now here's the question, and this is an important question. I want to reinforce it that you ought to keep in mind throughout the day. Specific policies. We do not ask for divine intervention here. You've got to be specific, and they've got to have a high probability of working. Significant. We don't define significant, but significant is something higher than getting off the Endangered Species Act, or in Canada, the Species at Risk Act. So they've got to be fishable runs using our definition. Wild salmon, we don't define wild salmon, but you just can't come out and say, well, let the hatcheries crank out fish like they do in Japan or the Kenai or some other place. You've got to have a plan for wild fish. Through 2100, don't worry about what's going on right now. You can't tell if any policy prescription will work for at least 50 years. You've got to go through a couple of ocean cycles to see if it's going to hold up. These are the project participants. I think the average experience in the field was like 31 years. These are not generally junior people. In fact, you reach a stage eventually where, you know, pretty much everybody looks kind of junior. But anyway, they are very experienced people. They cover the gamut from British Columbia to California. They cover a broad policy perspective. A lot of these people disagree vociferously on what policy ought to be. These are the ones that will be speaking today. Actually, there are 33 participants, but there's 24 policy prescriptions because we invited 24 people, and they brought in some colleagues, so that's how we end up with 33. These are the ones today. There's 5, actually some co-authors here too. They'll be presenting some representative policy prescriptions. These aren't the only ones, but they kind of represent the types of policy prescriptions that are going to be in the book. Now, these are strong-willed people, and even though they donated their time, this was a labor of love and usually a contribution towards the culmination of their careers. They don't agree on lots of things. And so our focus constantly was answer the question. Answer the question. Don't lob grenades at your opposition over there. Don't try to undermine their policy prescription. Assume you are the king or queen, what would you do? Now I'm going to move to the end here and wrap up with a few things. One are some conclusions. The near consensus, and I only say near because there were 1 or 2 people who were kind of ambiguous and couldn't quite bring themselves to say this, but virtually the consensus is current recovery strategies across the region will not succeed long term. Now I don't want to be too ambiguous about this, but the near consensus opinion was the probability is approximately 0. It's not going to work. Secondly, if you're going to recover wild salmon through the century in significant numbers, substantial changes must take place. Not tweaks, not minor evolutions of what we're doing, substantial changes. But there are viable options. This is not an issue with no choices. There are options. In fact, we're offering 24 of them that in our view would work. Now, I want to make a point here very clear. We're saying here major changes are needed if society really wants to do this, not tweaks. Now, most of us here like to work on the 4 H's, hydro, harvest, habitat, so forth. That will not do it. Those are easy to do. They're relatively cheap because they don't cause tremendous social dislocation. but they will not restore wild salmon runs through this century unless the policies deal with the 4 core policy drivers that are laid out. Now, I want to conclude with something that I did not cover. Should society do any of these? Should they develop a policy prescription that would work? This is not a choice that the project should or is going to make. I don't have a policy preference here. I can tell you if you do what you're doing, it's not going to work. And we've offered 24 that would work. Now, whether society ought to do this ultimately is going to have to be a public choice that's decided in a democratic process and not about technocrats such as myself. Thank you much.